Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Beehive State, Utah. Named after the Native American Ute tribe, the name Utah actually literally means people of the mountains. The mountains on the east side of the state capital and largest city, Salt Lake City, get an average of 500 inches of snow every year, and it's very, very dry, very powdery snow, making it ideal for skiing. And on the opposite side of the city from those mountains is the lake where the city takes its name, the Great Salt Lake. It is about 75 miles long, 35 miles wide, and I just recently learned has an average depth of just about 13 feet. So the majority of it is likely no deeper than your local swimming pool. Utah has 4 congressional House districts, and the current balance of power is 3 Republicans to 1 Democrat. The most recently added district, that 4th district, is what flipped most recently from Republican to Democrat in 2018. Utah's 4th is easily the most urban district. It covers much of Salt Lake City, and Democratic Ben McAdams defeated incumbent Republican Mia Love 2 years ago, despite the district having a partisan lean of plus 13 into the Republican column when compared to the national average, making that the outcome of that race a major upset 2 years ago. The final outcome of Utah's 4th, actually, there was a difference of about 700 votes, I think, out of more than 250,000 votes. Razor-thin margin. McAdams is running for a second term this year against a Republican challenger, Burgess Owens, who is a former NFL player for the Oakland Raiders and the New York Jets. Owens is running a pretty firebrand conservative campaign against McAdams this year. He's a frequent guest on Fox News and throws around terms like, Marxist, socialist, they hate our country to describe DC Democrats, which is peculiar for a state like Utah because, as we'll learn later, it's not the Trumpiest of red states. But we'll find out soon if that approach does indeed work for Owens this November. But in the meantime, let's take a look at a double line graph to see how Utahns have voted for their representatives over the last decade. Let's pull that up right now. So here, nothing too surprising. Honestly, the regular ups and downs that coincide with presidential years versus midterm years that we would expect. And with a state as Republican as Utah, we would expect that red line to consistently be higher than the blue line, which it certainly is. 2016 saw a pretty large turnout for House candidates, for Republican House candidates. But as we'll learn in a later section, less impressive turnout for Donald Trump. What's also worth noting in this graph is the increase in turnout on Democrats' end from 2016 to 2018, as we've seen in so many other states so far in the series, largely within the more urban, suburban districts around the country, and Utah is certainly no exception. Their 4th district obviously flipped from Republican to Democrat, as I've already mentioned, so the increase in turnout from 2016 to 2018 was largely within that district alone, and the reason why all 4 of Utah's districts are not currently represented by Republicans. Okay, now tossing that graph aside, I'll give you what I think is going to happen in Utah's 4th this year. I do think it is going to flip back into Republican control after 2 years of having a Democrat. Remember that the district does have a partisan lean of plus 13 into the Republican column, which is a pretty partisan lean when compared to the national average. The fact that a Democrat was able to win it all in a non-presidential year, that being 2018, was a huge shock to me personally. Although it was by less than 1,000 votes, it was about a 700 vote difference that got Ben McAdams to Congress in the first place. I don't see him pulling off an upset like that again this year, especially now with more Republicans probably snapping out of complacency after having lost Mia Love 2 years ago. And as we just saw from the line graph, Republicans are keeping up with the increasing numbers for Democrats. I mean, their turnout in 2018 was better than it was in the previous midterm election cycle, that being 2014. I'm not sure Burgess Owens is taking exactly the right approach for a state like Utah, but it is just Republican enough that I think he will be able to pull off a victory this year. So let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Up next, we have a gubernatorial election in Utah. Current Republican Governor Gary Herbert is eligible to run for a 3rd term this year, but has announced that he is not seeking a 3rd term and instead has endorsed his lieutenant governor to be his successor this year. That lieutenant governor is Republican Spencer Cox, who is running against a Democratic law professor named Christopher Peterson for the governor's position this year. Utah actually has not had a Democratic governor since the beginning of 1985, which is the the second longest streak for any one party in the governor's mansion across the country, with South Dakota being number one. So bearing that fact in mind alone, it already seems like there's pretty rosy prospects for the Republican candidate this year. But to confirm whether or not that's the case, let's look at some voter turnout ratios right now. And yeah, looking at these numbers, they kind of confirm what we could already sort of guess looking back over the state's history and how they elect governors. Republicans do have a very, very, very clear edge over their Democratic opponents. These percent values that we're seeing are actually relative to raw House turnout numbers. So basically, this most recent election cycle, 2016, current Governor Gary Herbert, who is a Republican, received about 5.63% more votes than all of the Republican House candidates running in the state of Utah that year. Whereas the Democratic challenger received just under 10% fewer votes than all the Democratic House candidates running in 2016 that year. And bearing in mind that Republicans consistently have better turnout numbers at the House level in the state of Utah, compounded with these voter ratios, certainly spells doom and gloom for Democrats running for the governor's mansion. Okay, let's toss those numbers aside. Because Gary Herbert, the incumbent, is not running again this year, we have no approval rating to consider in our calculations when trying to determine how this is going to happen in November. So we're only considering raw House turnout numbers and how they relate to the trajectory of those voter turnout ratios. For that, we turn to Pollbot to calculate how this is going to go down. Pollbot. And there you have it, Republican Lieutenant Governor Cox winning the governor's mansion by about a 27.18% margin of victory over Democratic challenger Peterson. To be perfectly honest, I think this estimation represents the low end of how a Republican might perform in this race this year. The last two election cycles, at least, for the governor's mansion in Utah, have seen the Republican carrying it with about a 40% margin of victory. The reason that margin has tightened significantly to this 27.18 is likely because of the surge in turnout for Democrats going from 2016 to 2018, although they did not pass Republican numbers when compared to past Democratic performances over the past decade. It is a huge improvement going into this last election cycle in 2018. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the margin of victory is. I can say with certainty that the Republican is going to win the governor's seat this year. So let's make that official and put it on our gubernatorial map now. Mark it. And now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Utah is a state that last voted for a Democratic candidate for president 56 years ago when they elected to send LBJ to the White House over Republican challenger Barry Goldwater, as did most of the states in this country that year. The state more recently elected Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton by about an 18% margin of victory. 2016 also saw Utah give independent candidate Evan McMullin, who is a native of Utah, about 21.5% of the vote within the state, which is by far the most votes that a third-party candidate received 4 years ago. As a result, Trump's margin of victory of 18% over Hillary Clinton still did not have him cracking 50% of the vote. And in fact, that margin of 18% is significantly less than some of his immediate Republican predecessors like Mitt Romney and George Bush. So there's something curiously unique about Trump within the state of Utah. Let's take a look at some presidential to House voter ratios to try to figure out what that is. So yeah, looking at these, it's pretty evident here that Utahns had a bit of a bone to pick with Donald Trump, especially when compared to Mitt Romney in 2012, who is a Mormon, a practicing Mormon, in a state as heavily Mormon as Utah is. And in fact, not only did Donald Trump's voter ratio significantly decline from Mitt Romney's going from 2012 to 2016, but Hillary Clinton's actually improved by nearly 10 percentage points over Barack Obama 4 years prior, which is odd because she was a much less popular candidate overall within this country. But seemingly enough people in Utah were turned off by Donald Trump's approach to the presidency to either cast a vote for independent candidate and Utah native Evan McMullin or even Hillary Clinton. It's the reason why that margin of victory of 18% that Donald Trump got 4 years ago was much less than Mitt Romney got in 2012, and even that John McCain or George Bush got in 08 or 04. Trump has shown either an unwillingness or an incapability over the past few years to win over enough of the Mormon vote to really truly make an impact in a state like Utah, and even to a lesser degree in states like Arizona, which we'll get into much later in the series. The Utah brand of conservatism is more more old school than the rest of the country has sort of steered towards in recent years, especially with Trump at the helm, taking a very America first approach to the presidency, severely imposing tariffs and limiting trade options for America's workers. Plays well in some states, but Utah is not one of those states. So let's toss those numbers aside. Let's also take a look at Trump's approval rating within the state of Utah. He is at a +6 net positive approval rating within the state. Specifically, he has the approval of 51% of Utahns and the disapproval of 45%, so just barely more than half approve of this president. Donald Trump's ongoing spat with Utah Senator Mitt Romney is certainly not helping him gain favor for a lot of Utah's voters, as Mitt Romney was pretty decisively elected to his current position in the state. And so at this point, I expect Donald Trump is performing worse in Utah than he could be if he put in a little more effort to this very specific niche of his voting bloc. But getting back to 2020, let's take what we know about raw House turnout, about those bad turnout ratios for Donald Trump and his lukewarm approval rating within the state to calculate how this election is going to go down in November. Pollbot. So in a Trump versus Biden matchup in the state of Utah, we have Trump winning the state by a 19.67% margin of victory, which, yes, is a slight improvement on his end from 4 years ago. Without a Utah native like Evan McMullin running again this year, you would expect it to be quite a bit better than 18%. But like I've already sort of touched on, Trump has not really made much of an effort to win over the Mormon vote, which is a significant chunk of the voting bloc in Utah at this point. And so one could almost view the 19.67% margin of victory to not be much of an improvement at all, considering that there's not going to be a third-party candidate receiving 20% of the vote this year, most likely. Utah would have to be much less Republican at its core for it to even be remotely in play at all this year, but it traditionally a very Republican state, as we know. It hasn't elected a Democrat in 56 years to the presidency. So I think it's going to be a pretty assured victory for Trump this year. So let's make that official and put it on a presidential map now. Mark it. So all the election results are in for the Beehive State. It's all pretty good news for Republicans. Let's now take a look at an old line graph and two new ones to talk briefly about the future of Utah. So first, let's look a little bit closer at our raw House turnout graph that we were looking at in one of the earlier sections of the video. I want to turn your attention specifically to those slope values that you can see for both of the equations on this graph, specifically that 51.5 for Republicans and that 34.4 for Democrats. In the context of this graph, what that means is when you look at the last decade as a whole, on average, every 2 years over the past decade, Republicans have received an increase of 51,500 more votes than they did in the previous election cycle. And when you compare that to the Democrats' improving numbers of 34,400 every 2 years, we still see a Republican Party that is breaking away from the Democrats in Utah by just under 20,000 votes every 2 years, which is why their dotted line is increasing at a quicker rate than the Democrats. This is largely the reason why I do think Utah's 4th district is going to flip back into Republican hands this year, because with a margin of victory that Democrats got of just 700 votes out of 250,000 cast in the district, Democrats would need a slightly better slope value from this graph to be able to stay competitive with Republicans in that district, despite it being the most accessible district to Democrats. Next, I want to bring your attention to these other two line graphs. These lines represent the average rate of increase or decrease for those voter ratios that I was using earlier in my calculations. First, looking at the estimates for gubernatorial to House voter ratios, we see slightly improving numbers for both parties, but they're improving at about roughly the same rate. And of course, we see Republicans holding a consistent edge in that regard, in this category, leaving me with little reason to believe that the way Utahns vote for governors will change drastically in the upcoming years, and why I think they're just going to stay the course with electing more Republicans to that office for years to come. The presidential to House voter ratios, on the other hand, it's particularly drastic in Utah because they went from Mitt Romney, a practicing Mormon, to Donald Trump, whose lifestyle is at times at odds with Mormon ideologies. And his approach to governing is a major turnoff to many of Utah's Republican voters. It's largely the reason why they gave such a huge portion of the vote to Evan McMullin 4 years ago, and even why they gave a higher voter ratio to Hillary Clinton than they did for Barack Obama. I don't expect Trump's voter ratio to be much better This year in Utah, I do expect it to be slightly better because there's not a major Utahn in the race this year. And I even expect Joe Biden to have pretty comparable voter turnout ratios to Hillary Clinton this year, as he can sometimes have crossover appeal to people from the other side of the political spectrum. Of course, as drastic as the rate of change in these voter ratios are, it's not going to be enough to make up for the fact that many more Republicans turn out for House candidates in Utah in the first place. So ultimately, I think in a post-Trump world, we might return to 2012 levels, maybe even 2008 levels in these voter ratios for presidents in Utah. So let's toss all those graphs aside. My final consensus on Utah is that it is going to remain a Republican stronghold for a very long time, for the foreseeable future at least. We did see Democrats make inroads slightly in 2018 when they were able to flip one congressional House district by a very, very slim margin. I do think it is going to flip back into Republican control this year, and I do think once Donald Trump is out of the White House either this January or in January of 2025, that Utah will go back to its more solidified Republican standing in the country. They're just having trouble reckoning with Trump at this point because of Trump's unique ability to not be appealing to the Mormon voting bloc. So, long story short, Utah, very Republican, staying Republican, slightly less for the next few years, but maybe going back to being more Republican after then. That just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.